Hello, and welcome to Changing Minds, the podcast that explores how the latest advances in psychology, behavioral sciences, and neuroscience are being used to address some of society's most pressing issues. I'm your host, Gorkan Ametoglu. The notion that human decision-making isn't rational and is full of biases has become increasingly popular in the last couple of decades. An important question, of course, then, is to what extent can companies use the knowledge of these biases to influence consumers' choices? But perhaps an even more intriguing question is whether consumers are aware of their own biases and whether they can do something about them, say by choosing what they wish. So are consumers aware of what's going on? And what would they tell you if you asked them? With me to discuss these issues is Rob Bain. Rob is the director of Mountain View, a company that applies consumer psychology and behavioral insights to help brands and businesses to grow. Welcome to Changing Minds, Rob.
Thanks, Gorkan. Great to be here.
All right, so I'll jump right into it. First question, I'm intrigued by the claim that consumers lie. I mean, I don't imagine that you mean that they actually lie, so I'm curious to understand what you mean by that.
Well, we're interested in understanding the motivation, the biases, the influences that lead to a disconnect between what people think they do and what they actually do. And I think in some situations it's obvious we give people motivation to misstate or to mislead us. For example, if we go to the doctors, we know that patients are unlikely to be wholly honest in self-reporting their diet and exercise habits when they might perceive that the truth might be met with disapproval. So that's probably an example of a conscious distortion of the truth. But I think in most situations, and certainly the situations that we're most interested in, there isn't intent to deceive or mislead, but for a variety of reasons, people are unable to accurately describe their motivation, their actions, or their intentions. Now, if we could just continue to gather these examples of differences between perception and reality, we might say, well, that's enough. But I think if we can get a better understanding of why these differences exist, we can develop a much better framework for understanding how people make decisions and how we can influence these decisions. And for businesses in particular, how we can make better decisions.
Fantastic. So you mentioned situations where people are unable to accurately describe their motivations and actions. What would be an example of this?
Well, let's take an everyday task like grocery shopping, which is something we spend a lot of time studying. So say we want to understand something empirical, such as how long do people spend making a decision between different brands? And there might be a variety of reasons why you want to know this. There are two obvious approaches that we can take. One approach is simply to ask people, how long do you spend deciding between brands? And to accept this, we accept certain assumptions. So for example, we accept that they don't have any obvious incentive to lie or mislead us. We accept that they'll be familiar with a shopping task, the kind of task that we're asking them about. And that's a reasonably safe assumption because most people shop at least once a week. So we might accept a number of assumptions and ask away. But the other way that we can do that, the other way we can get that data is to observe people making decisions. We can set up cameras in store and we can measure how long people are actually spending in front of the fixture. And we can calculate how long people are physically present. And perhaps there's an assumption that they're not making their brand choice before they get to the fixture, but we can have a fairly good read on how long they're actually spending at the fixture. Now, if our assumptions are correct, the results between those two data sources should be the same. But they're not. And when we ask people how long they think they spend deciding between brands, they'll vastly overestimate the time taken. In our research, we found people will typically overestimate by a factor of 5 or 10 times longer than they actually spend there. So you might think this is a trivial difference, but it reveals a distortion in our perception that has really interesting implications for anyone that uses consumer data to make decisions.
Fantastic. All right. So from the example you've just given, I mean, what you're saying essentially is that you've got two conflicting data sources, one which is, what people say and the other is what they do. I mean, how do you interpret this conflicting data and I guess what are the implications of this?
So yes, in this example, you've got two different types of data and they appear to provide two different answers, which is a situation I'm sure many people have experienced. You've got claim data on the one hand that shows people what they think they do, and you've got observed data or behavioral data that shows what they actually do. And I think they're both revealing in different ways. as a general principle, people think they're thinking far more than they actually do. And I know this won't surprise you or any other psychologists, but we often overestimate the extent to which our decisions are smart, reflective, calculated, when in truth we rely on instincts, we rely on shortcuts, we rely on experience. It becomes even more interesting when you ask people to explain how they're making their decision. You'll find they report a level of conscious evaluation, conscious consideration, comparison that just simply couldn't have taken place in the time that's available. So I would treat the claim data a little like you're asking people what speed they think they were driving. And I would treat the observed data like the speedometer reading. Observed data is often more reliable for understanding how we behave, especially when it comes to routine behaviors and low risk, low involvement decisions, which are very common in the environment we study most often, like supermarket shopping, because we're not usually thinking about them. I think the challenge for most businesses and for researchers that are associated is that observed data is much more difficult to get hold of. It's often much more expensive, and so very often we'll accept claim data as a proxy. And this works if the assumption that what people think they do aligns with what they actually do. But as we've seen too often, this just isn't the case. So we think we're making decisions on the basis of insights, but in fact, we're basing them on inaccuracies. And the question I've often posed to clients in the past is whether having bad data is better than having no data at all. And it's often an uncomfortable question to ask because it challenges people to re-examine the assumptions of their research. And frankly, that isn't particularly exciting for many people because it requires a conversation about details. And I think the reality is that most businesses, particularly large businesses, international businesses, the focus is on speed, scale, simplicity. But if we can agree that bad data leads to bad decisions, then I think we can start to address it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, we often hear, like I said in the introduction, I guess, about biases in decision making, but I feel you've given a sort of quite interesting angle on how they impact what consumers think they do versus what they actually do, right? So, and I guess my feeling here is that what you're talking about should have quite serious implications to some extent on consumer research that's done, particularly in the industry. Would you agree?
Yes, well, I think perhaps there's quite a simple provocation at the heart of it, which is the availability of data shouldn't lead us to assume that it's valid. And we probably have to spend less time thinking about the ease and accessibility of the data or the outcome and try to spend more time considering the biases and issues that might become what we often call like barriers to truth. So I guess our provocation is to spend as much time thinking about the inputs as we do often analyzing the outputs. My real interest is looking more broadly at why perception and reality are detached, rather than evaluating specific methodologies, but it's probably a natural consequence of the work that we do. When it comes to research, I would encourage people to think about these barriers to truth that I mentioned and how they might impact or influence the data that you collect. There are generally three that I talk about, and conveniently we simplify them just to C's, just for simplicity. But we talk about cognizance, we talk about compliance, and we talk about conformity. And these are things that really people should spend a lot more time thinking about because they can distort the outcomes of the research. And again, to the point that having bad data is one thing, but making bad decisions can be extremely costly, time-consuming, resource draining for businesses. We're interested in how can we design better research. Cognizance refers to whether people are aware or knowledgeable of the thing that you're asking about. And if I give you a really simple example of that, if I ask you to describe how you ride a bike, you may be perfectly competent riding a cycle, but you may not be aware or thinking about what you're actually doing at the time. Principles like counterbalance, counter steer as well, the weight difference when we go around corners and things like that. They're largely automatic and intuitive. They're not really things that we think about because they're things that we've learned by doing. And in situations like this, somewhat counterintuitively, asking people to explain their actions might not give us any better understanding of the mechanics or process involved. So the vast majority of shopping behaviors, which is where we spend a lot of our time, the vast majority of those behaviors more closely resemble riding a bike than they do playing a game of chess, for example, in the amount of conscious decision making that's taking place. And this leads to some fairly predictable errors. For example, people tend to vastly overestimate, for example, how much of the store they visit. You know, there are various different studies on this, and there are several different numbers that are available. There's a chap called Sorensen who did a lot of work on how fast and how far people travel within a store. But you can see that people vastly overestimate how much of a store they'll typically visit on a shopping trip. We can see in specific categories, you know, almost half of the people that claim to be daily drinkers of a soft drink simply won't even purchase it the following week. People who claim to be highly price conscious, they can't accurately describe the price of items that they say they buy regularly or even items they've just bought. So it affects a number of different domains, you know, when we think about this gap between what people think they're doing and what they're actually doing. And perhaps the challenge is that people think they can describe what's going on. You know, there's nothing more compelling than a person telling you that they're fully conscious and fully aware of the thing that they're about to describe. You know, and that's really where I think the challenge for people like ourselves as researchers is to evaluate what is and isn't cognizant. And we have to be careful that we're not asking people to think about things that they don't naturally think about. So that would be one example, but we also talk about compliance, and this is just a tendency that people have to follow another person's lead, and in this case, most commonly a researcher's lead, into making statements or saying things, expressing ideas or opinions that they wouldn't necessarily outside of a research setting. So Gorkan, if you buy a brand and I offer to add something that makes it even better, then you'd buy more of it, right? Mm-hmm. You know, that would be a sort of classic led by research kind of question.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've seen this personally. So I spent most of my career before the role of Mountain View. I spent most of it as a client-side marketer. You know, I've lived this experience where I worked on a brand that we want to know if we should add vitamins to our product. And we observed that it performed extremely well in research. And because frankly, why wouldn't it? You know, if we offer you the same product you know and love to a group of people that already buy it and say, we're going to make it even better, it would be somewhat counterintuitive to say that you wouldn't buy it more often, or maybe be prepared to spend more on it, or whatever the research outcome was desired to be. But in market, it failed, and it failed really badly, and it was an expensive mistake for the business that I think was perfectly avoidable. If we recognize that people don't make these hyper-rational comparisons of features and benefits when they're shopping. Compliance also leads people to study things or attend to things in a way that they wouldn't naturally in the real world. And you know, you'll be familiar with this, with the undivided attention that you can be afforded in a research setting. It can be very tempting to explain every product as if it's a Swiss Army knife, you know, and how could you fail to be convinced if I tell you it has this feature and this benefit and all of these other differentiators that make it the very best product? The challenge is, the reality is outside of that setting, you have perhaps a second of someone's time in the kind of environments that we're generally dealing with. So you have to think about simplification and prioritization in order to have a chance. You also see compliance when you ask people to imagine or project. There's some research, I think I've shared it with you previously, that we ran last year, where we were looking to have a little bit of fun, but we're also hoping to make a serious point as well. And as a little background, you know, marketers often like to treat brands like babies. You know, they have personalities, they develop relationships, they're loved. You know, and all of this serves a variety of purposes. And sure enough, there are plenty of companies that will offer to identify and measure your brand's personality. But if you're already on board this train, it can be hard to stop and think, do consumers actually describe brands as having different personalities? And what's the evidence of this outside of a marketing department? So what we did was replaced brands with rocks, and 5 different rocks to be precise. Sedimentary, metamorphic, all the types you learned about at 12 years old on a geography field trip. And we asked them to rate them on a variety of personality dimensions. So, for example, are they honest? Are they intelligent? Are they competent? Are they sophisticated rocks? From memory, my favorite was down to earth, which I think you and I can agree is a very important characteristic for a rock.
Probably the most accurate, yeah.
So do you think that participants in that study said, look, this is an absurd question, I can't possibly answer this? Or do you think people take the voucher that they're given for participation and start providing answers?
Yeah, I'm sure that they get the voucher, yeah.
So sure enough, consumers started to pull apart differences, and they started providing data, and some rocks were more honest, and some were more sincere. And at the end of the study, we went on, and having described the personality of these rocks, we then asked them, if this rock was a celebrity, what or who would it be? And having answered the personality questions, they started to pick celebrities. And I remember that one was Prince William, and one was Bill Gates, and suddenly we had rocks not only with personalities but celebrity profiles as well. So the serious question then is, what have we learned here? Maybe for some, we've confirmed that rocks do indeed have personalities, and marketers should start thinking about the opportunities to commercialize them. But I think in reality, what we've actually done is we've just confirmed that consumers will comply with instructions, even if you provide them with really poor direction. And then finally, we talk about conformity as well. And, again, as a third barrier to truth, and one that deserves, I would provoke a lot more time than it actually gets. And it's simply a tendency to provide answers that we perceive to be acceptable or desirable or maybe even idealistic. And this can influence research in a few different ways, from the design and framing of stimulus to analysis and interpretation of results. I think at a most basic level, we're social animals, so we want to fit in, we want to be accepted. And so particularly in situations where we think there's limited investment or reward, we'll often respond the way that we think we're meant to. It's a sort of role play that takes place. And it's not a new phenomenon. I know, you and I both know very well. I think I can go back to the 1950s. I'm sure you can go back much further with these experiments, like Solomon Asch with the conformity experiments. I'm sure that the studies have existed, and you'll know those better than I do. But for the benefit of listeners, his studies showed the extent to which people's own judgments and opinions are influenced by others around them, even when those people are complete strangers. They showed a group of people a variety of different lines of different lengths, and they asked people to compare which lines were of similar length to other lines. It sounds maybe a little more complicated than it actually is. But what they found that was really interesting was that people would ignore and even overrule their own senses and beliefs in order to conform with a group. And this effect increased with the complexity of task, and I think it increased with the group size as well, up to a point. But this obviously has some profound implications, and one obvious area is things like jury trials, where we rely on 12 people having independent evaluation and independent judgment. We know that they are prone to being influenced, and they often talk about a jury effect where one or two people can have a disproportionate influence on the outcome, which is obviously not how that system is designed. Market research, the direct equivalent of the jury trial is focus groups, and that's a format that's often used to evaluate creativity and innovation. You bring people into a room together on the assumption that 10 people bring 10 independent points of view. But we know often that isn't the case. So they'll ignore and overrule their own judgment, their senses, their beliefs in some instances in order to conform. And by the way, it's not just limited to focus groups. You see it in surveys too. If you ask questions like, how important is this issue to you? Sometimes they talk about this being the acquiescence bias, which is a tendency to agree it's very important, even if in real world you've never given it a moment's thought. So, we see that trend towards overclaiming behaviors that are socially desirable, and you can see it in a number of different arenas. If you look, the populations that say they're most politically active and most politically informed are very often the same cohorts that are least likely to vote as well. So sometimes you see big gaps between what people say they'll do and what they'll do, and whether you're going to make certain dietary choices, whether you're going to buy certain types of food, whether you're concerned about waste and the environment, things like that. You can see that people are aware of what might be perceived as a desirable acceptable answer, and very often they'll sort of massage their answers to kind of conform rather than risk some form of confrontation. There was a great reference which was in a book by John Steele, which said that a survey of business people staying in hotels revealed that I think 70% said that the gym was the most important factor for them when determining which hotel to stay in. And I think the number is that 17%, actually used the gym. There are so many examples, and I think too often we design to get the outcome. We don't design or spend enough time on that input. And with conformity, you can debate whether it's motivated by desire to conform, or whether it's to be desirable, or whether it's to avoid conflict. The result is the same. We often prefer to say what's easy and acceptable rather than speak our mind and risk confrontation. So that's a long answer to a short question, but those are 3 barriers to truth that in my view we should spend considerably more time talking about than we actually do. And by the way, that is only to give you an answer about the influences on participants. We haven't even talked about the other half of the equation, which is our role as researchers and how we can influence those outcomes. But that's at least to talk about 3 areas that I am always encouraging the teams, the partners that I work with, to look at more closely to make sure that we're designing for reliable outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, certainly thought-provoking, I would imagine, for anyone that you tell this to, from the businesses that you work with. But I mean, I'm quite interested in sort of the sort of information that you've given us, which is that consumers seem to be either unaware of their own decisions, how they make decisions, or they're somehow biased. I mean, why do you think that is?
There are different theories, and I think actually we've started to recognize that there are different reasons for different effects, or maybe I should say different causes for different effects. I mean, I think some of the most common theories that exist point to evolutionary origins. So, just as our reflexes help us to avoid physical harm without needing to consciously think and act, evolution over millions of years has created a series of mental shortcuts that help us to save energy and stay safe. And the issue is that we're just not aware of these mental reflexes. Sometimes it's described as system 1, system 2 thinking, but the reality is, we are only conscious of what we're conscious of, and there's a large part of decision making which is very clearly automatic, instinctive, non-conscious, and we can't really account for or explain that part of the process. So it's something we really need to factor in. I think also we tend to overestimate the extent to which we drive our own decisions in the first place. We're largely aware of the role that context and environment play in shaping and influencing the choices that we make. I've never met anyone outside of marketing that thinks they're influenced by advertising, but they're making the mistake of thinking that you see ad and go buy product, like it's a sort of binary response. And we know advertising doesn't work like that. We can see the effect, we can measure the effect. We know that it's a softer and subtler influence on memory, which usually takes place without our awareness. So we've seen this in a variety of different domains. We see subtle cues like music, smell, signage. These can all guide shopper behavior, but they often go unnoticed and as a result unreported. And that can lead people who are analyzing this to think that they are having a limited effect, but actually they can be having quite a profound influence on behavior. It's just that the consumers, the people that we're studying, haven't picked up on the influence that it has. There's a very well-known study that looked at the influence that music can have on wine purchasing. And they tried playing different music on different days, and they asked people whether they were aware of the music that was being played. What was interesting was very, very few people were aware that the music was being played, but the shopping habits on the days where the different music was being played was quite profound. You could see it clearly influence people's behavior, and quite consistently. So the challenge is, I think we have to take the responsibility as researchers to try and understand these and design around them. If you want to understand these sources of influence, we need to start with the consumer, start with the people, start with the wiring of the brain, start with the decision-making process. Then we need to look at some of the sweeping assumptions that we often accept when conducting research. I think we need to be more critical in challenging some of them. And then finally, our subjective and sometimes selective interpretation of research. One of the things that I often say to clients is you can give the same research debrief to two different people, and if they want to have two different outcomes, they can find them within the same document. So I think the first step is to recognize some of the biases that I've mentioned, and some of the things that you and I have spent many hours discussing. Because if we start to put a bright spotlight on some of these biases, some of these influences, if we can get a better understanding of consumer decision making and our motivation, we can start to close that gap.
Fantastic. I mean, yeah, I think this is all really, really intriguing, and like I said, I'm sure that companies will be thinking about the implications. And I, personally, obviously, we know each other, and I think you are kind of the voice in the industry for researchers like myself and my colleagues. But I'm curious to understand whether the challenges that you're describing have always been relevant, or are they particularly relevant now? I mean, what's your view on that?
So you and I probably get the same question in different forms. So, I know, because I've been with you, when you get the question, so as a psychologist, can you read my mind?
Yeah, the most common one, yeah.
Yeah, I forget how you respond, but it always makes me laugh. The same question that I get is, when you become aware of these biases, can you overcome them? And I think people are hoping or expecting me to say, yes, of course, I'm impervious to these effects. But I work in marketing, so clearly I believe in the power of brands to begin with. I don't think there's any escaping or avoiding these biases and shortcuts, because it's no different to understanding your own biology. You can probably make some changes, but the fundamentals are hardwired. Sometimes I think I'm falling for them, actually, more than an average consumer, because there's sometimes where I see them and I think they're very creatively deployed, so I want to reward them for their creativity. But these are biases that have developed a really long time, and it's hard to start putting numbers to it. But I think it's obvious to anyone studying it. Our brain is not evolving as quickly as our smartphone. I think the challenge is it's really something that very few businesses spend enough time on. And there are several studies that have shown both experts and amateurs feel much more confident in decisions when they have data. And what's really interesting is that even if the data isn't relevant to the decision they're making, they still feel more confident making a decision. So in some cases, data is a comfort blanket. And I think the challenge that we can articulate and we can see very clearly is sometimes bad data is leading to the bad decisions. And so what we're trying to do is to make sure that the quality of the inputs is there, and that we're acknowledging that human behavior is not like computer behavior. And so what we're trying to do is to try and use our awareness, our knowledge, our expertise of consumer decision making, and trying to apply that so that we can hopefully lead to better outcomes. And decisions that cost time and tremendous amounts of money can be aligned with robust, reliable evidence. So if we're going to make a breakthrough on this, we have to start with our knowledge and expertise of the consumer and build the system around that. Certainly technology is helping us. It's helping us tremendously. It's helping us to make sense of the data, but it's not helping us to make sense of decisions.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks very much, Rob. We are at the end of our session now. I just think it's been extremely stimulating, and I'm sure really thought-provoking for our audience as well. So many thanks, Rob.
My pleasure. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the chat.
All right. And thanks everyone for watching. You can access all the previous episodes on the UCL Changing Minds website. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.